Senator Siewert. Senator Singh.
I rise to speak on a matter of profound importance to Australia's identity as a compassionate and fair nation. This country's migration policy for refugees and asylum seekers has become an international disgrace. It has been 4 years since asylum seekers and refugees have been incarcerated in detention centres on Nauru and Manus Island. And when I recently attended a vigil on the lawns of Tasmania's Parliament House to join with the local community from Hobart and in solidarity with people all around Australia to light a candle for the men, women and children who languish in limbo in those offshore detention centres, I realised just how long the community in our country have been asking for our government to end this incarceration and uphold our international human rights obligations. The Guardian's published Nauru files, reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the At What Cost report by Save the Children, and the work of organisations like the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and many others have painted a desperate picture. Limited access to basic necessities, frequent exposure to harm, violence and abuse, including the sexual assault of children, and significant harm to mental health leading to self-harm and suicide. With their futures stuck in this torturous, indefinite confinement, they've waited and waited and waited and slowly been driven mad. The Papua New Guinea High Court has ruled that the detention of refugees and asylum seekers on Manus Island's relocation centre is unconstitutional and is illegal. The High Court has ruled that the detention of refugees and asylum seekers on Manus Island is a fundamental breach of their human rights. The court has ruled that the centre must be closed, and the Papua New Guinea's High Court's ruling is a clear signal of just how wrong we've got things. It is the clearest sign that the government needs to do better. It must do better. And yet, the situation has not got better. In fact, it has got worse. As of the 31st of July, the Department of Immigration and Border Protection reports that some 791 people remain on Manus Island and 371 on Nauru. The rest of the world looks at our actions with dismay and disbelief that we could treat people in this way, people that sought refuge in our country. Heather Higginbottom, who's the former US Deputy Secretary of the State for Management and Resources under the Obama administration, and she's written recently in the Time magazine about the administration's opposition to our policy and that the foundation for the swap arrangement with Australia was in fact a desire to assist the people that we refuse to assist. She writes, "These people who risked their lives on makeshift boats to flee conflict and the lack of access to basic means of survival, but were turned back by an Australian government that refuses asylum seekers who arrive by sea. As we fuss and fret over the clash of presidential and prime ministerial personalities, actual human beings suffer." That is correct. Actual human beings suffer and have continued to be suffering for the last 4 years. Last week, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees made a statement, and it said, and I quote, that it is gravely concerned by deteriorating conditions at the Manus Island Regional Processing Centre as authorities seek to relocate people to Lorengau and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea. The announcement of the closures of the centre, in the absence of appropriate alternatives, is causing acute distress among refugees and asylum seekers. UNHCR is deeply saddened by the tragic death of a young refugee yesterday, which also highlights the precarious situation for vulnerable people on Manus Island. Well, I too am saddened by the death of Hamed Shamish Shapur. We are told that Hamed suffered acute mental illness for over a year. We are told that his condition was known to authorities and that concern for his welfare was repeatedly raised by his fellow asylum seekers, refugee advocates and others. And yet he died under our watch in a camp run by Australian Border Force, and this government doesn't even care to investigate why. The power in the Manus Island Detention Centre has been cut off. Access to water is limited. The newly built transit centre has just 300 beds reportedly, less than half of what is required, and current residents of the centre are being threatened with criminal charges if they do not move. With these ongoing attacks on asylum seekers and the death of 5 people since Operation Sovereign Borders began, detainees are understandably stressed and terrified to breaking point. To argue that the serious and real fears for the welfare of detainees that are raised over and over and over are merely a matter for PNG, that Australia can just wash our hands, is an act of such terrible cowardice by this Turnbull government. We cannot abdicate responsibility for what occurs on Manus Island. The people who suffer and die there are there because our government placed them there, because our government kept them there for years and years on end. They came to us for help, and our fear politics sent them away, banished them to this island prison. The government paid for these camps. The government is responsible for the consequences of what goes on at these camps and of our actions. Even US President Donald Trump wonders why we do this. Being told these people are not bad in his leaked phone call with the Prime Minister, President Trump said, and I quote, "Well, maybe you should let them out of prison." This is Donald Trump saying this. Who would have thought I'd be quoting Donald Trump in a speech? And is there anything more telling or more deplorable than the Prime Minister's assurance to US President Donald Trump, and I quote, "We will take anyone you want us to. So we would rather take not a very attractive guy that help you out than to take a Nobel Prize peace winner that comes by boat. That is the point." Well, those 3 sentences goes to Australia's reputation as a decent and sensible country right there from the words of our own Prime Minister. So what does that mean? That means that Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Thomas Mann, among others, Nobel laureates, refugees, they're the kind of people that Malcolm Turnbull would keep out of Australia if they travelled by boat, which many of them in fact did. They're the people Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull would keep out of Australia so that he could let in anyone the US wanted us to let in, even if they were not very attractive guys. And he tells President Donald Trump that he doesn't even need to take a single refugee. There's just a need to be holding up an appearance of compliance. That just shows you the lack of compassion, the lack of understanding, and the lack of resolving the issues in our immigration policy by this Prime Minister. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull says in relation to the deal, "It does not oblige you to take one person that you do not want. That the obligation is to only go through the process." How ridiculous. What kind of Prime Minister, what kind of leader do we have that says that? What a terrible, terrible sham. A swap where we take whoever the US doesn't want, and in return they are obligated to take nothing. How is that in anyone's interests, let alone our own national interests? And where does it leave the people of Manus Island and Nauru? What this ultimately comes down to isn't politics. It's not about winning a vote or wedging opponents. It isn't about slogans or catchphrases. It's about people's lives, people with families, people with hopes and dreams, people who came to us for help,
Senator
and we
Singh.
cannot turn them away.
Your time has expired.